A cold wind whispered through the bustling city streets, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain on asphalt. Evening had settled, casting a grayish-blue haze over the world, while pedestrians rushed home, their faces buried in scarves and their eyes fixed on glowing foam screens. Nobody noticed the old man sitting by the corner diner, his frail body wrapped in layers of tattered clothing. His hands, weathered and trembling, rested on an old tin cup filled with a meager handful of coins. He had been there for hours, watching life go by, as it often did, without so much as a glance in his direction. People rarely looked at him. Perhaps they didn't want to. Perhaps it was easier to ignore the figure hunched over with years of wear and hardship etched into every line of his face. But tonight was different. Something in the air felt heavier, more charged, though he couldn't explain why. The diner door swung open, spilling warm yellow light onto the cold pavement. A young man stepped out, his tall frame silhouetted against the glow inside. His coat was neatly pressed, his shoes spotless, and his face carried an air of quiet confidence. He seemed out of place here, like he belonged in an office downtown or a luxury car cruising through the city. Yet, here he was, walking out of the humble diner with a small paper bag in hand. The old man's gaze followed him instinctively. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the man carried himself, or maybe it was simply curiosity, a rare spark in the monotony of his days. But just as the young man reached the edge of the sidewalk, he stopped and turned back, locking eyes with the beggar for the briefest moment. The old man felt a twinge of embarrassment. He looked down, fiddling with the rim of his tin cup as if to make himself smaller. But the young man didn't walk away. Instead, he approached, his polished shoes clicking softly against the concrete. "Have you eaten?" the man asked, his voice calm but direct. The beggar hesitated. It had been days since his last proper meal, but he wasn't one to complain, especially to strangers. "I'm all right," he muttered, barely audible. The young man crouched slightly to meet his eyes. "You don't look all right," he said, his tone softening. "Come on, let me get you something." Before the old man could protest, the young man turned and walked back into the diner, leaving the beggar sitting there, confused and overwhelmed. Moments later, he returned with a steaming plate of food wrapped neatly in foil. He handed it over with a small smile. "Here, enjoy." The old man stared at the plate, his hands trembling as he accepted it. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You didn't have to." "It's nothing," the young man replied, rushing off the gratitude. "Take care of yourself." He was gone just as quickly as he had appeared, disappearing into the crowd and leaving the beggar to wonder who he was and why he had stopped to help. But the night wasn't over yet, and fate had a way of weaving its threads in mysterious ways. Hours later, when the old man finally rose to leave, he stumbled upon something lying in the spot where the young man had stood earlier. It was a small, folded piece of paper. Picking it up with shaky fingers, he unfolded it to find a note inside. The words written on it sent a chill down his spine. "Tomorrow, meet me at this address." Below the message was an address scrawled hastily in pen. The old man's heart raced as he stared at the paper, the weight of its implications sinking in. Why had the stranger left this for him? What could he possibly want with an old beggar? The answer would come soon enough, but for now, the city's lights blurred in the rain as the beggar clutched the note tightly, unsure whether to feel fear, hope, or something in between. The next morning came slowly for the old man, each passing hour stretching like a lifetime. Sleep had evaded him, as it often did, but this time, it wasn't the cold or hunger keeping him awake. It was the note. The words scribbled on that small piece of paper felt like they carried a weight far heavier than their size. "Tomorrow, meet me at this address." Why? Why would someone go out of their way to reach out to someone like him? He had spent years being invisible to the world, years of learning not to expect kindness, let alone something so mysterious. As the gray light of dawn spilled over the city, the old man found himself staring at the address again. It wasn't far, he realized, just a few blocks away. But that didn't ease his nerves. He wasn't used to stepping into the unknown, and this felt like walking blindfolded into a place he didn't belong. Still, a small part of him, buried beneath years of disappointment, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this could be something good. With shaky hands, he folded the note and tucked it into the pocket of his coat. He adjusted his scarf, his movements slow and deliberate, as if preparing for a journey he didn't fully understand. The streets were alive with their usual chaos, cars honking, people rushing, the smell of fresh coffee wafting from nearby cafes. It all felt distant, like a world he could see but not touch. When he arrived at the address, he froze. The building was nothing like he expected. It wasn't a shelter or a charity or any place that might make sense for someone like him. It was a sleek, glass-fronted office building towering above the crowded street below. The kind of place where people wore expensive suits and carried briefcases. He glanced at the note again, double-checking the address. This was it. His first instinct was to turn around and leave. He didn't belong here. But before he could take a step back, the door opened and a young woman stepped out. She was well-dressed, her hair tied neatly back, and her expression professional but kind. She looked directly at him, as if she had been expecting him. "Are you Mr. Lewis?" she asked, her voice calm and polite. The old man blinked, startled. He hadn't heard anyone use his name in years. It sounded foreign, almost as though it belonged to someone else. "Ah, yes," he stammered, unsure of what else to say. "Come with me," she said, holding the door open. "Mr. Harris is waiting for you." Mr. Harris? The name didn't ring a bell. Still, he followed her, his worn shoes making soft stuffing sounds against the polished floor. The inside of the building was pristine, with bright lights and modern decor that only made him feel more out of place. He kept his head down, avoiding the curious glances from the well-dressed people passing by. The woman led him to an elevator and pressed a button for one of the upper floors. The ride was silent, save for the faint hum of the machinery. When the doors opened, she gestured for him to step out. "This way." They walked down a long hallway until they reached a set of large double doors. She knocked once, then opened them, revealing a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city skyline. Standing by the window, his back to them, was the young man from the diner. "You came," the man said, turning to face him. His smile was warm, but there was something else in his eyes, something unreadable. The old man shifted uncomfortably, clutching the edge of his coat. I don't understand. Why am I here?" The young man gestured to a chair near his desk. "Please, have a seat." Reluctantly, the old man sat, his body tense and his mind racing with questions. The young man took a seat across from him, folding his hands on the desk. "Let me introduce myself properly," he began. "My name is David Harris. I'm the CEO of this company, but that's not why I brought you here." The old man's brow furrowed. None of this made sense. Why would someone like David, a man who clearly had everything, want anything to do with someone like him? David leaned forward slightly, his expression serious now. "I know you've had a hard life, Mr. Lewis. I know you've been on the streets for a long time. But I also know there's more to you than what people see." The words caught the old man off guard. How do you know anything about me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "Because I've been watching." "Not in a bad way," he added quickly, noticing the old man's wary look. "I've seen you out there, helping people, even when you had nothing yourself. I saw what you did last week when you gave your last dollar to that woman and her child. You didn't have to do that, but you did." The old man's chest tightened. He remembered the woman, how desperate she had looked, how her little boy had clung to her, crying. He had given them what little he had, thinking he could get by somehow. But he never expected anyone to notice, let alone remember. "I don't understand," he said again, his voice trembling. "Why does any of this matter to you?" David leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Because people like you are rare, Mr. Lewis. You may not have money or a home, but you have something most people don't, kindness, even in the face of hardship. And I think the world could use more of that." The old man didn't know what to say. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and a faint glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in years. David stood and walked over to a cabinet, pulling out a file. He placed it on the desk and slid it toward the old man. "This is for you," he said. Inside, you'll find everything you need to get back on your feet. A place to live, a job if you're willing, and some money to help you get started." The old man stared at the file, his hands trembling as he reached for it. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. It was real. All of it was real. "But why?" he asked, looking up at David, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do this for me?" David smiled, his expression softening. "Because someone once did the same for me. I wasn't always in this position, Mr. Lewis. I know what it's like to struggle, to feel invisible. And I made a promise to myself that if I'd ever got the chance, I'd help others the way I was helped." Tears welled up in the old man's eyes as he clutched the file to his chest. For the first time in years, he felt seen, truly seen. And in that moment, he realized that perhaps his story wasn't over after all. The old man sat in stunned silence, clutching the folder as if it might vanish at any moment. His mind reeled, struggling to make sense of everything that had just happened. For years, he had lived in the shadows, unseen and unheard. And now, out of nowhere, this stranger, this young man, had extended a lifeline. It felt too good to be true, and a part of him couldn't help but wonder if there was some kind of catch. "Why me?" he asked again, his voice breaking. "There are so many others out there. Why not someone else?" David leaned against the edge of his desk, his gaze calm and unwavering. "Because I believe in paying attention to the people who the world tends to overlook. You caught my eye, Mr. Lewis. And when I saw what you did for that mother and her child, even though you had nothing yourself, I knew you were the kind of person who deserved a second chance." The old man shook his head, tears slipping down his weathered cheeks. "But I'm just a nobody. I don't even know if I can start over." David's expression softened, and he crouched slightly to meet the old man's eyes. "You're not a nobody. You're more than what life has thrown at you. I'm not offering you charity, Mr. Lewis. I'm giving you an opportunity. What you do with it is entirely up to you." The words sank in slowly, but deeply. The old man could feel something stirring inside him. A faint, flickering light he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the first glimmer of self-belief. He didn't know if he deserved this, but the thought of turning it down felt almost impossible. David straightened and glanced at his watch. "Take your time to think about it. You don't have to decide anything today. But before you go, there's one more thing." The old man looked up, puzzled, as David walked over to a side table and picked up a small envelope. He handed it to him with a quiet smile. "Open it when you're ready." With that, David walked him to the door. As they reached the elevator, he paused. "One last thing, Mr. Lewis," he said, his tone light but sincere. "You're not alone anymore. Whatever you decide, know that someone cares." The elevator doors closed, and the old man was left alone with his thoughts. As he stepped back onto the bustling street, he found himself gripping the envelope tightly. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he walked aimlessly through the city, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The file in his hands felt heavier with each step, a tangible reminder of how drastically his life might change if he accepted what had been offered. Finally, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the city in hues of gold and pink, he sat on a quiet bench in the park. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The words made his breath catch in his throat. "Mr. Lewis, I didn't tell you this earlier because I didn't want to overwhelm you, but you and I have more in common than you might think. Years ago, I was in a similar place, lost, broke, and ready to give up. A man I barely knew helped me when I needed it most. He saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. That man was you. It was nearly 20 years ago. I was just a kid back then, sitting on the steps of a grocery store, hungry and scared. You handed me a sandwich and told me, 'Hang in there, kid. The world's tough, but so are you.' I never forgot those words. They carried me through some of the darkest times in my life. So, this isn't just about helping a stranger. It's about repaying a debt I've carried in my heart for years. You gave me hope when I had none, and now it's my turn to do the same for you. Sincerely, David Harris." The old man's hands shook as he read the letter again and again, the words blurring through his tears. Memories of that day came flooding back, a young boy with hollow eyes and torn clothes, sitting alone in the cold. He hadn't thought twice about helping him. It was such a small act, one he had almost forgotten. But to know it had meant so much to someone else, that it had changed the course of their life, it was almost too much to process. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, not out of sadness, but out of something he hadn't felt in so long it was almost foreign: gratitude. The world, for all its cruelty, still held pockets of kindness, and sometimes the smallest acts of humanity could ripple outward in ways he could never have imagined. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The old man, whose real name, George Lewis, sounded strange even to his own ears after being unused for so long, began taking the steps toward rebuilding his life. With David's help, he moved into a modest apartment, got new clothes, and even started working as a caretaker in one of David's community outreach programs. It wasn't an easy adjustment. Years on the streets had left scars, both physical and emotional, but for the first time in forever, he felt like he had a purpose again. Word spread quickly about George's story, and it became a source of inspiration for many in the city. People who had once ignored him on the streets now stopped to say hello, to offer a kind word or a smile. George, in turn, made it his mission to pay forward the kindness he had received. He volunteered at shelters, shared his story with anyone who would listen, and became a mentor to others who were struggling. As the seasons changed, so did George. The man who had once been invisible was now a beacon of hope for so many. And though life still had its challenges, he faced them with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. The world, it seemed, had a way of surprising him when he least expected it. On a quiet afternoon months later, George sat in the park where he had read David's letter. A group of children played nearby, their laughter filling the air. He smiled, watching them, and thought about the journey that had brought him here. He thought about David, the boy he had once helped without realizing the impact it would have. And he thought about the countless others who had yet to experience their own second chance. In that moment, George knew one thing for certain: no matter how dark life might seem, a single act of kindness could light the way. And that light, once shared, could grow brighter than anyone could ever imagine.